I don't like confrontation and I try to avoid it whenever possible. Frederick contacted the counseling center with an obvious feeling of discomfort and sheepishness. He requested an initial session due to some vague and lightly detailed anxiety and relationship problems with his longtime girlfriend. He rescheduled the intake session twice before finally trudging in for his afternoon appointment. He presented as a light-hearted and unassuming man in his mid-20s who seemed, at least to his therapist, to be someone who worked hard to silently blend into his surroundings and not make waves. Frederick described a fairly normal work life as an information technology worker for a large company managing the help desk and performing basic repairs on their computer system and giving guidance for using their software. His problems, he stated, came not from his job, but from dealing with his relationship problems overall, and specifically his girlfriend, with whom he was living in a nearby condo and had planned on asking her to marry him. As the session went along, he described his girlfriend as frequently frustrated with him and as trying hard to get him to either interact with her on a stronger level or set boundaries for an intrusive mother and or a couple of friends. These intruders would invite themselves over to the apartment and take over his space and their space. And take over his time and their space. Frederick admitted that his condo was frequently overrun by buddies who dropped by to play video games and that these unannounced visits were a regular source of tension between him and his girlfriend Amanda. But he just couldn't bring himself to put the brakes on his friends coming and going because he didn't want to make any of them more upset than he did his girlfriend. He also admitted that his mother was occasionally very possessive about her place in his life and had been causing issues with his girlfriend. He did, however, deftly dodge taking any responsibility for the situation with several versions of "that's just mom" statements, while acknowledging that the prime reason he was sitting in the office was trying to find a way to save his relationship with her. When pressed on this reality, Frederick visibly flinched and forced out an admission that, "I just hate having problems with anyone. I avoid conflict whenever I can, and I try to keep everyone happy." Frederick admitted, however, that this approach to life has left him with a troubled home life and in need of change. I can imagine that there are people in this world who absolutely relish the idea of conflict and are attracted to it like a moth to streetlight. You'd have to think that professional fighters would have to enjoy conflict to want to step into a cage and fight for a living. Or that there's a certain kind of person that's a corporate officer who likes the life and death struggle over a boardroom conference meeting table. Most people who appear to like conflict probably don't see it that way, though. Instead, they see conflict as merely a means to the end of getting what they want, when they want it, and from whom they want it from. Perhaps this is all too broad of a discussion to start with, and the real situation with conflict is that people may like it in certain scenarios, in certain situations, or with certain people. I've seen some pretty non-confrontational people get pretty excited doing battle on a video game screen playing Call of Duty, as though their life is dependent on it. But in any event, most of us folks would consider ourselves to have a normal sense of conflict, would say we do it in the situations that we have no choice. For example, let's take Frederick and agree that he generally makes sense on the onset, as it's a pretty logical thing to think and feel when you say that you want to avoid encounters that are unpleasant and that you want to have transactions with other people that are pleasant. Who in general would argue with that? It sounds pretty logical to me in its simplest form. Human nature is to seek comfort, pleasure, and security, as well as to avoid pain and conflict. I absolutely agree with the first part of Frederick's self-talk, and no one should relish confrontation with other people that will either make them hostile towards us or make relationships uncomfortable going forward. As we talked about in another chapter, Seeking harmony and emotional congruence is a wonderful principle, one that almost all forms of religious faith and spirituality as a center value, and psychotherapy is right there with them, and trying to improve the synchronicity of your relationships. The problem that I have with Frederick's conversation within himself is the part about, and I avoid it at all costs. This is where the distortion lies, and where he ends up bringing misery upon himself and subsequently to everyone around him. Let's get into this in the way that might get me in some trouble. Part of what I do the most in my private counseling practice is teach people how to negotiate with their current relationships so that they can reduce their anxiety by learning assertiveness and work through long-held depressive feelings and beliefs by learning to stand up for themselves in the heat of battle. Why do I do this? Well, because the two primary kinds of relationships that we have in our lives, with our employer and at work, and with our romantic partner that we choose to live with all our lives, requires us to be able to negotiate in order to get our basic needs met and avoid being taken advantage of by folks on the other side who expect and want us to do things for them. Not everyone agrees with me on this. Some people believe that from the moment they make contact with an employer and have an interview, that there should be some sort of miraculous emerging of common goals and needs, and then everything should automatically and magically come into play. And then everything should automatically and magically come together. They also believe that there should be no essential need for labor and management to ever butt heads. Or there are people who believe the kindly-looking white-haired psychologist who owns a popular dating service who says that if you subscribe to will use his 10 or 15 areas of compatibility and he will find you a lifetime soulmate and he guarantees it. As you can guess, I believe that this is a giant truckload of manure that stinks long and hard, and I think that people can convince themselves that you shouldn't have any kind of tense negotiations with employees or employers or lovers, and that somehow you will all want the same thing and be on the same team. This seems like the sweetest and most desirable of all fantasies to me. I also happen to believe it's a tasty lie. You might be lucky enough to find someone to have some soft negotiations with that were particularly painful and maybe even were barely noticeable. But they were there. You may find out that you put together an initially easy to deal with someone or some employer, and that it got much more complicated and heated as relationships and their circumstances are generally fluid and ever-changing. So, if I'm right, then why is this? The obvious answer is that we generally don't want the same things other people want, and especially not in adversarial relationships like employer to employee or man to woman, where you're at cross purposes from the very beginning and both of you need the other to accomplish their own goals. It's a modern example of wishful thinking to deny that men and women generally have completely different reproductive drives and completely different goals and needs in the relationship. But I hear all the time, and I always wonder if people who try to convince themselves of that are either woefully naive or simply close their eyes to the world around them. I don't think the employer-to-employee relationship is nearly as strongly debated, as it is pretty empirical that the employer wants goods or services and the employee wants payments, benefits, and a positive working environment. This sets up necessary conflict in order to negotiate a relationship that is quid pro quo and mutually beneficial and acceptable, so that trust and appreciation can hopefully begin. Stepping outside these two very black and white examples, I think the problem with what Frederick was attempting to accomplish was that it would depend on everyone being in agreement that the negotiation process would always be pointed downwards to a goal of peaceful and gentle discussion. Most people don't share this idyllic goal of emotional peacefulness on a daily basis. Perhaps it's because one person in the relationship really, really wants something very badly and is willing to escalate the tension and emotional pressure at the bargaining table in order to get it. It's frequently also true that one person in a relationship has some hostility toward the other person they're sitting across the table from, and that is going to kill this idea of peace at all costs pretty quickly. The reality is that the person on the other side of the table may have completely different perspective of what's even being talked about to begin with. My general feeling is that we're really talking about the question of human nature, though. Anyone who's ever raised a child would not disagree with my statement that human beings are born consumers and instinctively want to get things from other people in order to feel comfort, important, safe, or to get gratification. If you accept this point, which I think is empirically logical, then it is also a common reality that we need boundaries, both physical and emotional, to separate our assets, both physical and emotional, from other people who want things from us. Sometimes those people who want things from us are well-meaning individuals who want to make a fair exchange. Other times, they are amped up consumers who really aren't thinking about fairness in the moment, and other times these individuals are hostiles who are making a territorial play to take what we have. Avoiding the reality that all relationships require some level of negotiation necessary to achieve any transaction, and that you have some responsibility to embrace some level of conflict in order to either achieve your own goal of the transaction or simply protect what you have, does not avoid the transaction itself. Frederick has unfortunately found that his desire not to participate in these negotiations doesn't keep the transaction from occurring, and that others simply power past him and take what they want. His mother doesn't stop from barging into he and his girlfriend's apartment because he refuses to sit down at the table and discuss whether she should or not and when. She just comes over and does what she wants because no one is telling her that she can't. His friends aren't setting boundaries for themselves and saying, gee, maybe we ought to ask Amanda if it's okay if we come over and play video games with Frederick in their apartment either. Both of them probably assumed that if Frederick didn't want them to come over, that he'd stand up for himself and say no, or place some conditions on what they want in the relationship. Avoiding the negotiation and the resulting conflict does not stop the transaction from happening. It only means that you are giving the other person or persons permission to decide what they think is fair and what they want, which is passive failure to protect yourself and your interests, and absolutely results in all kinds of anxious feelings and depressive symptoms and thoughts. People avoid the conflict central to negotiations for a variety of reasons, but it always starts with the basic reality that for them, conflict doesn't feel good. Let's do a quick review of why that might be so. I'm not comfortable standing up for myself, and I'm not comfortable saying no to others or expecting a yes from others. Some of us just have never been given permission to assert what we need or feel from our earliest childhood experiences and have never learned to do it. I've had many clients who were thoroughly oppressed by their parents that they never developed the confidence to claim anything as theirs. The ground floor of the self is knowing that what you like, dislike, want, and don't want. Some have had these very basic decisions challenged by overbearing caregivers and simply do not feel comfortable being decisive about anything for fear of being challenged, attacked, or being wrong. I'm afraid to be told no from others and want to avoid that feeling of rejection. Fear of rejection, to this powerful of a degree, usually points to underlying fears of abandonment. If you don't agree with everything the other person wants, then this will be a deal breaker and they'll walk away from the negotiating table forever. I want to please others more than myself and live for approval from others. This is the desperate desire for approval to the point of absolute self-sacrifice. Perhaps a parent figure has made themselves unattainable under normal circumstances and demanded absolute obedience. Or someone has such low self-worth for a variety of reasons that they need constant reassurance of their immediate worth. I can't stand hurting others' feelings and seeing them upset. Hypersensitivity to anyone outside ourselves, even feeling the slightest bit of denial of their desires, or experiencing even the mildest hardship, is an exaggerated sense of empathy. It avoids the question, is it good for someone to get everything they want all the time? I think relationships should come together naturally, without any conflict. We've covered this earlier as an example of wishful thinking, but let me pile on a little more. Think back to your earliest childhood memories at school, and the first time you were unleashed on the playground for recess. Who decided whose turn it was to be on the swings and for how long? Who decided on the game that you all played, and who made all the rules? When the kickball game was organized, who got to kick first, and who got to pitch? Did any of this ever come together perfectly and seamlessly without any negotiations or any conflict? Of course not. Listen, the stakes may change and vary from small to large, from unimportant to life and death, but the nature of relationships does not change. The avoidance of normal levels of conflict and confrontation within relationships is either a denial of your own value, skills, time, and person, a denial of emotional quality of relationships themselves, or it's an admission that you do not have the ability to assertively obtain what you want from others to keep them from taking the things that they want from you over your silent objections. This subject is at least a couple of chapters by itself and may become an entirely different book. But to cover it briefly here, the biggest shift that we make as relational and social human beings is the transition from helplessness and dependence of childhood relationships to the assertiveness and independence of adult relationships. When we're children, we really don't have the ability to negotiate across the table with our parents because we're not on a level playing field. Not being equals in terms of assets, consciousness, or ability means that we tend to get pretty much whatever our parents decided we would get. As we got older and reached towards independence and adulthood, they, being parents, should change, and we should feel ourselves growing and differentiating into separate people from them, who then have the ability to function as equals. The question is whether we move out of this position of learned helplessness and dependence and into an adult assertiveness so that we can motivate other people to give us what we want from them in equal and fair exchanges, or prevent others from taking what we don't want to give them. If we do, then we accept that conflict and confrontation are intricately and irreversibly interwoven into all of our adult relationships, and that we have to learn to negotiate assertively in a variety of different roles, situations, and circumstances in order to have a functional and healthy life, period. Hopefully, this assertiveness brings out successful management of conflict that is necessary to achieve the balance and fairness at the heart of healthy and trusting bonds with others, and that breeds mutual satisfaction and happiness. Frederick was a pretty tough customer to make progress with in the therapeutic sense, and avoided the inherent back and forth repartee and conflict with his therapist too. He would occasionally avoid sessions where the tension of the subject matter became uncomfortable. He struggled mightily with the idea that he had a firm responsibility to start developing some assertiveness and applying it to his relationships. Eventually, Frederick was able to communicate a deep sense of fear at making others angry, with fear that others would potentially leave him based on some of his experience with his parents. his father leaving the family, and his feeling of being abandoned by himself, and his feelings of being abandoned himself by his father. The therapist effectively challenged the idea that Frederick could somehow prevent others from making these kinds of decisions by completely and passively complaint with whatever they wanted, and that he was actually in the same boat now with a woman he loved and wanted to marry, considering abandoning him because he was so passive. This reality caused Frederick to show some deep and genuine emotions for the first time, and he became tearful at times when reflecting on his inner conflict from his past and how it affected his current conflict. Eventually, with the therapist's reflective challenging, he acknowledged the reality that he needed to accept that some conflict was necessary to effectively develop some sense of order in his life and protect his relationship to the woman he wanted to marry. Frederick's efforts were tentative at first, but he began setting some limits on how accessible he would be to his friends, and started protecting his personal space by blocking out time so that no one was allowed to drop by. He gave his girlfriend more security in the apartment they shared, and by also increasing the amount of time they spent together privately. Putting the brakes on his mother was a little harder, as she was very possessive of Frederick. Her behavior was probably an after effect of a painful divorce and not wanting to lose her oldest son to adulthood. But he plugged away at learning these new skills and eventually learned to gently but firmly risk her disapproval by putting his girlfriend's needs first. Frederick eventually asked for their key back from his mother. There was some anger and hurt feelings, but he stood firm in the pocket, and eventually his mother came around and accepted his new assertiveness. Finally, Frederick was more assertive in his relationship with his now fiancée, both with speaking to what he himself wanted from her and also stating his feelings about the directions that he wanted their eventual marriage to go. As time went along, he saw that the risk of disapproval and either anger or hurt feelings of others was far outweighed by the success he had in forming healthier and more structured and gratifying transactions, and embraced the need for some conflict in order to live a fulfilled life. Frederick left therapy after a year and 3 months, still not being completely comfortable with conflict, but capable of having adult relationships